There is a peculiar and largely unremarked phenomenon that has begun to manifest in certain corners of the economy over the past several years. A phenomenon that does not appear in the official statistics with a clear label, but which can be felt, if one is paying attention, as a kind of subtle change in the atmospheric pressure of daily commercial life. You might have noticed it yourself without quite being able to name what you were noticing. Perhaps in the slightly thinner crowds at the high-end restaurants that used to require reservations weeks in advance, or in the diminishing frequency with which your acquaintances post photographs of their recent purchases on social media platforms, or in the strange quiet that has settled over certain categories of discretionary spending that were once reliable engines of visible consumption and social signaling. The handbag that would have been proudly displayed in an unboxing video remains in its plain brown packaging. The new car that would have been photographed from a flattering angle in the driveway is now simply a mode of transportation rather than a statement of arrival. And the vacation that would have generated a week's worth of carefully curated content is now taken quietly, almost furtively, as if there is something vaguely embarrassing about being seen to enjoy oneself in a time of such visible economic anxiety for so many. This is not merely a recession in the traditional sense of declining output and rising unemployment, although those indicators have their own story to tell, but rather something more subtle and more psychologically complex. A recession of signaling, a contraction in the social performance of spending, a deceleration in what we might call the velocity of economic boasting. And because the modern consumer economy is built, to a degree that few people fully appreciate, on the fuel of social comparison and status anxiety, a decline in the visibility of spending is not merely a symptom of economic slowdown, but a cause of it. A self-reinforcing feedback loop in which the silence of one household becomes the caution of another, and the great engine of consumption that powers roughly 70% of the American economy begins, very quietly, to idle. The core concept we are examining here, the velocity of silence, is a play on the classical economic concept of the velocity of money, which measures the rate at which a unit of currency circulates through the economy and generates transactions in a given period of time. When the velocity of money is high, each dollar changes hands frequently, paying wages that become purchases that become revenues that become wages again, and the economy hums with the friction of exchange. When the velocity of money is low, each dollar sits idle in a bank account or under a mattress or in the digital equivalent of those inert repositories, and the economy slows because the energy that drives it, the movement of currency from hand to hand to hand, has been dampened. The velocity of silence is a related but distinct phenomenon, one that operates not on the movement of money itself, but on the movement of information about money. The signals that people send to one another about their spending habits, their financial confidence, and their social standing. In a healthy consumer economy, these signals are abundant and loud. The new car in the driveway, the remodeled kitchen shared on social media, the casual mention of an upcoming vacation to a destination that others will recognize as expensive, the subtle but unmistakable display of a luxury logo on a handbag or a watch or a pair of sneakers. These signals serve a crucial economic function that is almost entirely absent from standard economic models, which treat consumption as a private act of utility maximization performed by isolated individuals with stable preferences. In reality, consumption is deeply social, and the signals that people send about their consumption are the lubricant that keeps the gears of desire and emulation turning. When those signals go silent, when people stop boasting about their spending, the lubricant dries up and the gears begin to grind. The psychological explanation for why signaling matters so profoundly to economic activity requires us to revisit the work of the Norwegian-American economist Thorstein Veblen. who published his masterwork The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, and who introduced to the lexicon a phrase that has since become so thoroughly absorbed into everyday discourse that we rarely pause to consider its full implications: conspicuous consumption. Veblen observed that in human societies, the accumulation and display of wealth serves a purpose that goes far beyond the satisfaction of material needs and wants, a purpose that is fundamentally social and comparative. We consume not merely to be comfortable or to be entertained, but to signal to others and, crucially, to ourselves, that we belong to a particular stratum of society, that we have succeeded in the great competitive enterprise of life, and that we are therefore worthy of the esteem and deference that society accords to those who have demonstrated their fitness through the acquisition of visible markers of success. This signaling function is so deeply embedded in human psychology that it operates largely below the level of conscious awareness, and it is so powerful that it can drive people to spend money they do not have on goods they do not need to impress people they do not particularly like, a phenomenon that is simultaneously tragic and, from a macroeconomic perspective, immensely stimulative. The entire luxury goods industry, a global enterprise worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, is built upon the foundation of Veblen's insight, and a substantial portion of the broader consumer economy, from the mid-tier fashion brands to the premium automobile manufacturers to the aspirational travel and hospitality sector, derives its revenue not from the functional utility of its products, but from their signaling value. When the signaling goes silent, when people stop broadcasting their consumption to the social world, the demand for these signaling goods collapses, not because people have stopped wanting the underlying status they confer, but because the mechanism by which that status is communicated and validated has been disabled. A luxury handbag purchased and never seen by anyone other than its owner is a luxury handbag that has lost most of its economic reason for being. The mathematical breakdown of what happens when the velocity of silence decelerates across a broad population is both straightforward in its mechanics and alarming in its implications for the stability of the consumer-driven economic model that has prevailed in the developed world for the past half-century. Let us begin with the standard equation of exchange from monetary economics, which states that the money supply multiplied by the velocity of money equals the price level multiplied by the volume of transactions, or in its familiar algebraic form, MV equals PT. This equation is an identity, a statement of logical equivalence rather than a causal theory, but it provides a useful framework for understanding the relationship between the movement of money and the level of economic activity. Now consider a modified version of this equation that accounts for the signaling dimension of consumption, in which the total volume of transactions is not merely a function of the money supply and its velocity, but also a function of the intensity of social signaling, which we might denote as S. When S is high, people are actively broadcasting their consumption, which stimulates additional consumption by others who are exposed to those signals and who experience the familiar twinge of status anxiety that drives them to spend in order to keep pace. This additional consumption increases the volume of transactions, which increases the velocity of money, which further increases the volume of transactions, in a virtuous cycle that, from the perspective of aggregate economic growth, is indeed virtuous, even if its effects on individual well-being and household balance sheets are more ambiguous. When S declines, when the velocity of silence begins to supplant the velocity of boasting, this virtuous cycle reverses direction and becomes a vicious one. The reduction in signaling reduces the pressure on others to consume conspicuously, which reduces the volume of transactions, which reduces the velocity of money, which further reduces the volume of transactions, and the economy settles into a lower energy state in which everyone is spending less, not because they have less to spend, but because the social machinery that drove them to spend has been quieted. The mathematics of this feedback loop are not linear, but exponential, because each reduction in signaling by one household reduces the consumption of multiple other households who would have been exposed to and influenced by that signal. And the cumulative effect across a population of hundreds of millions can be substantial, even if no individual household consciously decides to reduce its spending. The systemic zoom out reveals that the velocity of silence is not merely a psychological curiosity, but a genuine macroeconomic force with the potential to reshape the structure of the consumer economy in ways that are both predictable and, for many of the industries and workers who depend on that economy, deeply unsettling. The modern American economy, and increasingly the global economy that has been organized around American consumption patterns, is built upon a foundation of discretionary spending that is, in turn, built upon a foundation of social comparison and status anxiety. The restaurants, the hotels, the airlines, the clothing retailers, the automobile manufacturers, the home improvement chains, the electronics companies, and the vast ecosystem of service providers that cater to the wants and whims of a consumer society all depend to a greater or lesser degree on the willingness of people to spend money on things that they do not strictly need for their physical survival or even their basic comfort. And a significant portion of that willingness is driven, consciously or unconsciously, by the desire to be seen spending money, to participate in the visible economy of consumption that marks one's place in the social hierarchy. When the velocity of silence takes hold, when people begin to feel that it is no longer socially advantageous or even socially acceptable to be seen spending conspicuously, the entire superstructure of the discretionary economy begins to wobble. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is a phenomenon that has been observed repeatedly in the aftermath of financial crises. When the sudden revelation of widespread financial fragility causes a collective recoil from the excesses of the preceding boom and a corresponding shift in social norms around spending and display. The Great Recession of 2008 to 2009, for example, was accompanied by a marked and sustained decline in conspicuous consumption, a shift that was widely remarked upon at the time, but whose deeper implications for the structure of the economy were perhaps not fully appreciated. The shift toward what was then called stealth wealth, or inconspicuous consumption, represented not merely a change in fashion, but a fundamental recalibration of the signaling economy, and the effects of that recalibration rippled through the luxury sector, the travel industry, and the broader retail landscape for years afterward. The current moment, characterized by a peculiar combination of low official unemployment, persistent inflation in essential categories like housing and food, and a pervasive sense of economic anxiety that does not quite align with the headline statistics, appears to be generating another wave of the velocity of silence, and the early indicators are visible to those who know where to look. The decline in social media posting about discretionary purchases, which has been documented by researchers studying consumer behavior on platforms like Instagram and TikTok, suggests that the signaling function of consumption is being muted, whether because people have less disposable income to allocate to conspicuous items, because they are redirecting their spending toward less visible categories like debt repayment and savings, or because the social rewards for visible consumption have diminished as more people struggle with the rising cost of necessities. The underperformance of certain luxury and premium brands relative to their historical growth trajectories, even as the overall economy continues to expand, is another data point that suggests a shift in the signaling equilibrium. And the growing cultural conversation around concepts like quiet luxury, underconsumption core, and de-influencing reflects a broader renegotiation of the social meaning of spending, a collective attempt to find new ways of signaling status and belonging that do not depend on the conspicuous display of newly acquired goods. The systemic implication of all of this is that the consumer economy may be entering a period of structural transition in which the old engines of growth, fueled by status anxiety and social comparison, can no longer be relied upon to generate the same levels of spending that they produced in the decades following the Second World War. This does not mean that the economy will collapse or that people will stop spending money altogether, because the satisfaction of genuine needs and the pursuit of genuine pleasures will always generate some level of economic activity. But it does mean that the growth premium that the economy has enjoyed from the endless escalation of conspicuous consumption may be diminished, and that the businesses, workers, and communities that have come to depend on that premium will need to adapt to a new equilibrium in which spending is quieter, more intentional, and less driven by the visible performance of prosperity. The identity shift that the velocity of silence invites and perhaps even demands is a profound one, because it requires a re-examination of the relationship between spending, signaling, and self-worth that has been cultivated over decades of relentless consumer messaging and social reinforcement. For the individual household, the quieting of the signaling economy presents an opportunity to disentangle the act of consumption from the performance of status, and to rediscover the more authentic pleasures of spending money on things that genuinely enhance one's life rather than on things that merely enhance one's image in the eyes of others. This is not a call for asceticism or for the complete abandonment of material pleasures, because material pleasures are real, and the enjoyment of a well-made object or a memorable experience is a legitimate component of a life well lived. Rather, it is an invitation to become more conscious of the motivations that underlie one's spending decisions, to distinguish between the purchases that are made for oneself and the purchases that are made for an imagined audience, and to recognize that the satisfaction derived from the latter is often fleeting and hollow, while the satisfaction derived from the former can be durable and nourishing. The identity shift involves relocating one's sense of status and belonging from the external world of visible consumption to the internal world of values, relationships, and purposeful activity. It involves finding new ways to signal competence, taste, and success that do not require the expenditure of large sums of money on goods that are designed primarily to be seen. And it involves developing a kind of immunity to the social pressure that drives so much of the consumption that leaves people feeling empty and indebted. An immunity that allows one to observe the spending of others with equanimity rather than envy, and to make one's own spending decisions from a place of clarity and intention rather than from a place of anxiety and comparison. The calm closing of this inquiry is not a prediction of economic doom or a call to withdraw from the commercial life of one's community, because commerce is the lifeblood of civilization, and the exchange of goods and services is the mechanism by which we provide for one another's needs and pursue our shared prosperity. The calm closing is, instead, an observation that the velocity of silence is a real and measurable phenomenon, with real and measurable effects on the economy in which we all participate, and that understanding this phenomenon can help us navigate the transition that may already be underway with greater clarity and less fear. When the boasting quiets and the signaling subsides, the economy does not come to an end. It simply changes shape, reorienting itself toward the satisfaction of more authentic and more durable forms of demand. The businesses that thrive in a quieter economy will be those that provide genuine value rather than mere signaling potential. And the households that thrive will be those that have learned to find their sense of worth in something other than the visible display of their spending. The silence that descends when the boasting stops is not an empty silence, but a pregnant one, a space in which new forms of value and new modes of living can be discovered and cultivated. And for the individual who learns to be comfortable in that silence, who learns to spend intentionally and to signal sparingly and to measure their worth by the quality of their relationships and the integrity of their actions, rather than by the visibility of their consumption, the velocity of silence may turn out to be not a loss, but a liberation, a quieting of the noise that has drowned out the quieter, more important frequencies of a life well lived.